I have in mind trying to break this chapter down into three main sections. We'll see if we can if we can keep it down to three. We may have to break it up some more. We're going to try to get down through verse 18 tonight, which will be the first main section, but we'll see if we can get there. So we know that it's been a couple weeks, or it's been a little while. I guess it's been a week and a half ago since we last talked about 1 Samuel. We left off in 1 Samuel 16. We know within that chapter we're introduced to David. We know about that account. The last thing that we talked about was verses 14 through 23 concerning David meeting Saul for the first time, right, and the relationship that develops between them. We understand that Saul had some problems. Obviously, we talked about the importance of the Spirit of the Lord departing from Saul and coming upon David in the sense of God's favor in terms of who is the anointed, or in the sense of the king. Even though Saul's king, God's already turned his mind toward David and eventually him becoming king. And we know that Saul's troubled by that. Perhaps what we look at in chapter 17 is also something that's causing Saul to be troubled in his mind. And so by the end of chapter 16, David really comes to Saul with the intent of trying to make Saul feel good about himself, right? And that's obviously done through music. And we know David, of course, is a very talented musician, as the Old Testament certainly records for us. We see, though, that David, he becomes not just a person who plays music for him. He becomes somebody that's very trusted by Saul. Verse 21 of chapter 16, that David stood before him, that Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. And David's going to essentially be a common presence in the household of Saul moving forward. And that's where we end in verse 23. As long as David played the harp with Saul, Saul would be encouraged, and as the text indicates, the evil spirit or the whatever troubling thoughts Saul had dissipated or went away. Well, chapter 17, we're going to see that in this particular case, David's going to come to the forefront to quell the fears of not just Saul, but all of the Israelites. But in this particular passage, David is of course, going to... we see the tension between David and Saul begin because of what David does here and what's recorded about this event in chapter 18. This is obviously a chapter that we've all studied before. It's a chapter in which kids, one of the more important one of the more common chapters I think that children study when they're learning about the Bible, the story of David and Goliath. And so what we want to do tonight is sort of talk about what we could say is the setting in verses 1 through 18. I've sort of entitled this in mind, Goliath at Elah, because we're introduced to, obviously, Goliath, but we're also introduced to the setting where all of this is taking place. All right, so we begin in verse 1. Let's read verses 1 through 3, which are sort of the setting for the events here. Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and were gathered together at Shokah, which belongeth to Judah, and pitched between Shokah and Azekah in Ephah-damim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched by the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them. So verses 1 through 3, obviously we've transitioned from the end of chapter 16. We're talking about a particular event, so we've got a transition here that's describing where this event's going to take place. Again, the phrase, now the Philistines gathered, generally the word now is just a way to state how some time has elapsed between the end of chapter 16 and the beginning of chapter 17. Now you note that several cities are given here in verse 1. You have the city Shokah, if that's how you pronounce it. Again, I'm not great at pronouncing these names. But the two cities, Shokah and Azekah, we're told that this is part of what is known as the lowlands within Palestine. And if you think about the lowlands, I looked at some pictures online of this area. We just went to the mountains recently for a few days. If you think about, if you're on your way to Gatlinburg, if you pass Huntsville and you're sort of in northern Alabama, northeast Alabama, you know that the land starts to go from being somewhat flat to you start to see these larger hills, right? They're not really mountains. Maybe they're mountains to us, but they're really large hills, and you sort of see them somewhat frequently because you're sort of getting at the base of the Appalachian Mountains, right? And if you've been that way, you can think in your mind you're sort of driving along, but you've got these larger hills that are sort of on either side of you. If you think about that, that's sort of what the lowlands looked like. That's what they look like today. And so if you're trying to get in mind a picture of where all this is taking place, based on the picture that I saw on the internet, I think about that part of northern and northeast Alabama where you're not in the mountains yet, but you can start to see those large hills that are on the sides of you as you're driving. We're told that this area is somewhere around 14 miles west of Bethlehem. And it's interesting to note that archaeologists have actually found evidence for the existence of these cities based on pottery that was found that was broken but had on the inscription of some of those pieces of pottery the names of some of these cities. In fact, there is a particular jar, a piece of pottery that actually has the word Shoka on it, and it dates actually all the way back to the time of Hezekiah, which he lived about 300 years after this, but it goes to show that these cities did exist. And certainly that's the importance of archaeology in a lot of ways. But again, we note that the armies that they have gathered together, verse 2, Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and then they are set the battle in array against the Philistines. So we keep in mind here what was said back in 1 Samuel 14, verse 52, where we were given a summation of Saul's reign as king. And one of the things that was said about Saul being king was that as long as he was king, they would constantly fight against the Philistines, all the days of Saul. And so in light of that, we certainly understand chapter 17, where we once again see Saul having to deal with the Philistines, which he's going to continue to do on other occasions. We've been told the cities in verse 1, but verse 2, we're told that this event takes place in the valley of Elah. What we're told about Elah is that it was generally the main pathway that the Philistines would use to invade Judah. And so this city, or this particular territory, is important to control because, say, if the Philistines take control of the valley of Elah, they have an open door to invade Judah. What we might could say is the last defense of Judah to protect Judah was the valley of Elah. And so it's very important for the Israelites to not let this territory go. And so we're told that this is not just a normal battle, but there's a lot of importance here concerning Elah and how it could be very easy for the Philistines to invade if they take it. So they're on opposing mountains, verse 3. Certainly a common theme. The Philistines stood on a mountain. The Israelites stood on the opposite side of the mountain. And certainly the expectation was if there's a battle that takes place, they meet in the valley and fight. And so we think about that setting that is given here for us. Now, verse 4, we are introduced to a Philistine that we have not heard about before, but who is obviously very important, very well known to us, and that is Goliath. All right, so verses 4 through 7, we are introduced to Goliath. Let's look at verse 4. And there came out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. All right, so we note about Goliath, and this is going to be stated over. It's going to be stated in different ways over and over again, is about this is a man of great stature, right? Verse 4, he is called a champion out of the camp. We get the word champion from the word campus, which means the field. And what the word champion means literally in that sense is a man who is successful in the field, right? We think about in sports, the team that is crowned as champion is the team that was successful or won on the field that they play on. Whatever competition that someone is declared the champion in, it's because that at the end of the day they were successful in whatever they were doing. So what we understand here about the word champion in part is that this is probably not Goliath's first time doing what he is doing here. He has proven himself to be very capable of fighting in the way that we'll talk about in a moment. But there's also the meaning here for the word champion. It also means between two camps, one who goes between two camps. And the importance of that word is that it indicates what Goliath does. Goliath is not a normal soldier based on this word, but what he does is that he goes out between the two armies and he essentially challenges somebody to fight him. Which we're told that the person who would often do this was not like a normal soldier. And so Goliath was essentially what we might think, we wouldn't say maybe like a mascot because we think about it in a comedic way sometimes, but when Goliath went out and did his thing and fought somebody, it was sort of seen as a way to boost the morale of the army, right? It was symbolic in that way. But Goliath, what he does is he goes out and he challenges the most mighty man, really in the sense of a fight one-on-one, which obviously we'll see later on. But that's what Goliath's job was. In a lot of ways, this boosted the morale of his, of the soldiers that he was with. We know, again, based on the cubit given, verse 4, he's 6 cubits tall. We're told that generally a cubit was measured from the tip of the middle finger all the way down to the elbow, which is about a foot and a half. So 6 times 1.5. The estimates are somewhere that Goliath was probably about 9 foot 9 inches. Could have been that Goliath had an abnormal pituitary gland. If Abby was here, she probably could explain that a little bit better. But with your pituitary gland, I believe that controls in part the hormones that help people grow, right? And if he has an abnormal one, maybe that has helped him grow to the height that he is. But there is something important to note about the city of Gath connected to Goliath's stature. All right, so let's turn in our Bibles to Joshua chapter 11 and look at verses 21 through 22. You know in the book of Joshua that part of what Joshua's role was is certainly to lead the Israelites, but also to drive the Canaanites out of the land of Canaan so that the Israelites could occupy the land. But in Joshua chapter 11, we're told about a specific group of people that Joshua deals with. Well, that's very important to the story in 1 Samuel 17. All right, so beginning in verse 21 of Joshua chapter 11. At that time came Joshua and cut off the Anakim from the mountains, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the mountains of Judah, and from all the mountains of Israel. Joshua destroyed them utterly with their cities. There was none of the Anakim left in the land of the children of Israel, only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod there remained. Now, the Anakim were a group of people that were called giants. They were called large. Now, you notice, of course, that in the process of the Anakim being driven out, the writer here records for us that they only remained in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. That's where they remained after the time of Joshua. So when we come back to 1 Samuel 17, we know that verse 4, Goliath is from the city of Gath. So very well could have been that he's a descendant from the Anakim that Joshua had driven out of Israel earlier on. and certainly explains his height in that way. So we have his physical presence, and here's the importance about this, right? We're given a lot. We're going to be given a lot about his armor in the next few verses, but again, the importance here about talking about Goliath was to present him as an adversary that would be thought to be impossible to overcome by any normal human means. Right? That's why there's such a focus on Goliath, is because not just because he was that big and he had all that armor, but in all, it posed and it showed that this was an adversary that in a lot of ways most people would have thought would have been completely difficult to overcome. And obviously that's going to put a lot of emphasis on David and his ability to overcome later on in the chapter. All right, so verses 5 through 7, we're given a description of his weaponry. He had a helmet of brass, verse 5, upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam. And his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him. So verse 5, he has a helmet of brass upon his head. We're told that the inside of the helmet probably would have been made up of sewn together skins of animals to provide padding on the inside of the head. Obviously, if you think about a football helmet, right? If you look on the inside of a football helmet, it's not just the metal on the inside, right? There's padding in it too, and that's to protect the head, to make it more comfortable. So obviously there's a level of comfort. If you put on a helmet of brass, if you don't want to have your head resting against that, you want some kind of padding in there, and that's what we're told that the helmet had on the inside. On the outside, obviously, it's overlaid with these brass plates. This is certainly similar probably to the helmet that Saul had in verse 38, the one that he tried to give to David. But he has a helmet of brass. We see, again, verse 5, that he has on a coat of mail. There are some translations that translate that as scale armor. And what it does is that this gives us the indication that at least the upper half of his body, there's not an open place where somebody could thrust a sword in. You're given the impression based on what's being described here is that if you looked at the upper part of his body, except for the face, there's no way that you could penetrate that armor, right? And it made him really impossible to attack in that way. As one commentator said, you think about what the top of his armor looked like. Think about the way that scales look like on a fish, or think about the way in which you think about tiles on a roof, right? And if you think about tiles on a roof, you're not going to leave any open places. Otherwise, you can have a leak through your roof. Just like on a fish, obviously the scales cover the entire body. And that's the indication that we're given here. There's no apparent weakness on the top half of Goliath here. We're told that the weight of all of this, the weight of the top half of the armor was 126 pounds. The weight of the armor in all, some have speculated, is somewhere about 270 pounds. So this is obviously a very large man. Verse 6, he had greaves of brass upon his legs, just armor that coated the front of the leg. We're told he has on his back a target of brass between his shoulders. This is either potentially a javelin or a small shield. And what it was designed to do by being, what we're told, what it was designed to do by being put on the back was to protect Saul's neck from somebody trying to swing at his head. And that was the purpose of it, to protect his neck. Verse 7, the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam. And I have not seen I probably have seen a weaver's beam, but I can't think about what part that would be. But again, the indication here is talking about the thickness of the spear. It's a very a thick object. If you think about if you think about in the Olympics and those runners that use javelins and they do the pole vault, right? And you think about the stick that they use, it's generally pretty thin and it bends pretty easily. The indication here is that it's a whole lot thicker than that, right? It's a very thick staff that he holds. On the head of that is obviously the spear. It's made of iron. It weighs 600 shekels of iron, which we're told is somewhere in the neighborhood of about 18 pounds. And so you think about that, an 18-pound spear is pretty heavy, or an 18-pound javelin would be pretty heavy, but only in the spear does it weigh 18 pounds. The rest of it weighs a whole lot more than that. So he's got all of this armor. He's obviously, again, the armor portrays him to be a very, a figure that's not going to be conquered very easily. And then you note at the end of verse 7 that he has one bearing a shield went before him. And we are told that the one that goes before him would have carried a shield that was much larger, probably about the size of a normal person's body. And so a lot of times we think about Goliath just going out there to challenge the Israelites. He also has somebody that's going in front of him that's carrying a full shield. And so by the time that we read about Saul coming out and challenging the Israelites, we're given a picture of a man that, from the perspective of the Israelites, it doesn't look like there's any way that one person could ever beat him in battle. And certainly this description is very important to describe why the Israelites outside of David are afraid of Goliath. I was thinking about application here. We certainly see it a little bit more later on, but we could point out here something that's similar. You think about in the perspective of the Israelites, we'll talk about why they're afraid later on. But sometimes we sort of have a tendency to look. We have a tendency to, if we're thinking about this from the perspective of the Israelites, sometimes we have a tendency to think too much on the physical and not so much on the spiritual. And what I mean by that is, Goliath had the appearance, again, that physically there's nothing that anyone could do to defeat him. And, sometimes we think about that within our own lives as well, right? We could say that that's one of the tactics of the devil. We think about the tactics of the devil. We may think about, temptation to sin, whatever, things that we struggle with pertaining to sin. But I think one of the things that we don't talk about that the devil often uses to get us to fall into sin is to doubt what we see before us, or to doubt in the power of God. If you think about this particular example, the Israelites had a lot of reason to doubt based on the physical appearance of Goliath. If one man went out to challenge him, he had a lot of reason to doubt based on the physical appearance that God could not deliver him, even though David's going to have that confidence. But we think about that for us as Christians. Sometimes we get so caught up, in what's going on, what we see with our own eyes, that sometimes we forget about trusting in God in that particular sense. And certainly David's going to be a good example of that. But maybe that's a good thought for us if we look at verses 1 through 7. Just because there's a very imposing physical challenge in front of us, that doesn't give us reason to stop trusting God, which is going to pay off with the example of David. Are there any comments that you'd like to add on to verses 1 through 7?
Well, like Peter, who, when he walked on the water, he looked at the storm instead of looking at Jesus. And when we do that, problems can certainly seem overwhelming.
Yeah, absolutely. The example was brought up, if you're watching this on live stream, the example was brought up was the example of Peter. And obviously the storm and the wind surrounding him at the time was something that caused him to sort of doubt and trust in God, because he's too concerned about what he physically saw before him, just like the Israelites are going to do here. So verse 8, we've got this description of Goliath. Now we read about what he essentially does to the Israelites. Verse 8, and he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel and said unto them, why are you come out to set your battle in array? am not I a Philistine, and ye servants to Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to fight me. If he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us. And the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight. And when Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistines, they were dismayed, and they were greatly afraid. We could call this Goliath's challenge to the Israelites. Also, what Goliath is doing here is he's sort of taunting the enemy, right? And we think about what the word taunt means. It means to make fun of. It means to, sometimes we taunt, sometimes the word taunt and people that taunt, they do that to try to provoke generally they want to provoke a really bad reaction from whoever they're taunting. And Goliath is certainly in his taunt just essentially making fun of the Israelites. He asks the question, why are you come out to set your battle in array? And perhaps what he's asking here is, why are you so foolish to come out and to think that you can challenge us? Or he could be saying it foolish in that sense, or he could be making the statement, you've got an overabundant sense of confidence. You've got a really false sense of confidence to think that you have the right to come out here and to oppose us in battle. He says, am not I a Philistine, and you servants to Saul? One of the things about the Philistines that I think we've noted before is that generally you had 5 important cities, and Gath was one of them. And generally when it came to the Philistines, the decisions, I think what we see in the book of 1 Samuel is that sometimes the decisions by the Philistines, there was a group of Philistines that came together and made the decisions for the people. If you remember when we talked about when the Ark of the Covenant was taken during the time of Eli, we read about the Philistines sending the ark back to Israel. But if you remember that there was a council called of the leading members of the Philistines to make a decision about this. And the point being is that Goliath very well may have been a son of royalty or a son of the nobility. And so what it would indicate here is that am not I Goliath the Philistine, and you servants to Saul, that Goliath is a noble, the people that are before him are simply poor and not very prominent people at all. Again, another way to taunt the enemy. Verse 9, he gives what appears to be a promise. If he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall you be our servants and serve us. So here is something that we don't think about when we consider this account. We don't have to think about this when we consider the account where the Israelites are facing Goliath. It's not just the fact that if one person goes out there that he has the potential to die at the hands of Goliath. But if he is not successful based on verse 9, what happens to the Israelites if Goliath defeats an Israelite in combat?
They're his servants. They're servants.
Yeah, the Israelites suddenly become the servants of the Philistines. That's what appears to be the conditions here, right? So we think about the fear of the figure of Goliath, but the challenge that he makes is that, if the Israelites are not successful, not only does that person die, but all of the Israelites, according to this, or at least the soldiers in the army, they're going to be taken as slaves to the Philistines. And so that's another challenge that is obviously imposing. We're going to see later on that when David defeats Goliath, it's interesting that the Philistines do not agree, or they do not abide by this statement that Goliath makes. So verse 10, the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. And so the picture that you would have is that the armies are arrayed in battle. And what would have happened is that the Israelites would send out a man to meet Goliath, and they would fight it out right there in front of both armies, within the view of both armies. And whoever won, obviously, based on verse 9, would benefit from those conditions. And so likewise by verse 11, Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines. They were dismayed and greatly afraid. And again, that just goes back to the fact that at this point, the Israelites are very much well too concerned about what physically was before them. They were too worried about how they were going to overcome the challenge that was physically before them that they forgot to put their trust in God. And we've seen this throughout the book of 1 Samuel, occasions where the Israelites over and over again failed in that matter. And I think, again, what's important here to note out, we talked about that, but another point of application to note here as well, you note that Saul is afraid, right? It doesn't just say the Israelites were afraid, but it does denote that Saul was afraid. And, if your leader is afraid, if he's not willing to put his trust in God, then those that are under him probably are not going to do the same, right? They're not going to be encouraged to do the same. You think about that within the context of a congregation, right? If you think about the eldership, right? If the eldership is living in fear, they don't have any confidence that, if they don't have any confidence in what God does, if they don't have any, confidence, just think about this example, right? If you think about a congregation that struggles to grow, there may be the discouragement and the idea that, maybe we need to change some things up in the sense that, maybe some things that are biblical, maybe we need to let those slide so that way we can gain more members. That could be the mindset of some people because they're physically solely concerned with how many people or what the number is back there on the attendance board, to the point that they're willing to sacrifice, they're willing to doubt their trust in God in terms of sticking to what he says, right? And that type of fear can not just stem from the eldership, but it can go into the normal congregation as well. Think about that within the home, right? If a husband or a father doesn't have any confidence in praying to God or in trusting God to handle problems, whether it's in the family or whether it's a problem going on with a family member, if the husband or the father doesn't have the confidence to rely on God, you're probably not going to see the other family members rely on God either, because that, unfortunately, that's sometimes how fear works. If there's fear in the leader, it's hard for those under the leader or the head to be confident. Perhaps that's the case here with the Israelites. All right, we'll look at the next few verses. We probably won't get all the way down to verse 18. So we transition from the battlefield to now looking at David. Verse 12, David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and he had 8 sons, and the man went among men for an old man in the days of Saul. And the 3 eldest sons of Jesse went and followed Saul to the battle. And the names of the 3 sons that went to the battle were Eliab the firstborn, and next unto him Abinadab, and the third Shema. All right, so what's described here in verse 12, generally it would be expected of all men, and Judah had the reputation of putting out some very powerful warriors. Verse 12 indicates to us that at this point Jesse is essentially too old to fight. And so instead of fighting himself, obviously he sends his representatives in the form of his sons. What verse 12 would also indicate to us here is that, if Jesse's an older man who's incapable of being able to fight, probably also indicates that David here is probably a man in his early 20s and not a little kid like sometimes it's portrayed. Now we've been introduced to the sons in 1 Samuel chapter 16 when Samuel went to meet Jesse and we're introduced to them. So we certainly know about that. Certainly the brothers of David are going to play a role in a moment once David goes and meets him. But verse 14, let's read verses 14 down through verse 18. It says that David was the youngest and the 3 eldest followed Saul. But David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near morning and evening and presented himself 40 days. And Jesse said unto David his son, Take now for thy brethren an ephah of this parched corn, and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp to thy brethren. And carry these 10 cheeses unto the captain of their 1,000, and look how thy brethren fare, and take their pledge. So we note that David is called the armor bearer, but we do note that at this point he's not expected to go into the battlefield. We see that he returns to his father to feed his father's sheep there at Bethlehem. Verse 16 is also important because, or it's just interesting to note because this is a constant thing that Goliath is doing, right? It's not that Goliath has come out and once a week or, a couple times of a week that he's going out and making this challenge to the Israelites, but the writer indicates to us that consistently, in the morning and then at the evening for 40 days, Goliath goes out and makes this same taunt. And for 40 days, not one of the men in the army of the Israelites is going to be confident enough to go out and to meet Goliath. So it indicates to us that everyone essentially knew about this challenge that Goliath has put forth. David's going to come and hear about it as well when we talk about the following verses next week. But we are going to go ahead and stop here, and we'll pick up verse 17 next week. But with that being said, are there any thoughts or comments that you would like to add on to what we've talked about tonight?
I just sort of wonder why Israel let Goliath make the demands. I mean, just say, no, we don't agree to those terms. We're going to fight the way we want to fight. But they let him dictate, the terms of the battle, which again, to me, reflects a lack of trust in God.
Yeah, right. That may be something that I look into for next week. It may have been something where it was sort of seen as a custom, or it was dishonorable to not respond in the way. Perhaps maybe that's why they didn't fight in a different way, but I may look into that for Bible class next week. But we'll go ahead and stop here tonight. Thank you for your time and thank you for your attention. We'll pick up in 1 Samuel chapter 7, verse 17 on next Wednesday.